Thank you for the time. I'm going to kind of go through it pretty quickly because I have a feeling there's going to be more questions and we can do a demo if we think that that's necessary. So for those of you who aren't aware, the Chest Injury International Database is live. We do have it available to any member of CIID, any member of CWIS through data share agreements, and we'll go through that. So what we need though is we need sites to join. And the best way to do that is to go online. There's an interest form. It forwards, of course, to the ever lovely and talented Sarah Ann Whitbeck, who really does the majority of the work here with the attorneys. And you will then need to communicate back to your facility how to go about signing the data share agreement and or materials transfer agreement, depending on how your institution defines this. And it's really important that you find the right people in your hospital administration. So what I recommend doing for that is finding out whoever sort of oversees the quality databases, so NISQIP or TQIP or your NTDB database. And then just to give you a sense of where we are, and this was a couple weeks ago. Sarah Ann, if you're on, you can chime in because I'm sure you have an update to this. So we have 7 institutions currently. There are 5 sites actively negotiating to bring us up to a total of 12. 20 more sites have the paperwork in hand and working through the process. Internationally, we have 5 locations. I do believe Australia, at least one of the sites, if not 2 of the sites, are going to be up pretty quickly into us. Sarah, are you on? Is there an update to that number?
That is the final number as of this moment. But we are, let's see. Nope, I take that back. There's 6 sites actively negotiating right now, and at least 20 on the working through the process.
Great, thank you. So you see it's like changes week by week.
Yes.
All right, so currently what are we collecting? We're currently collecting prospective data. We do have some retrospective data that's going in, but that's a little bit dicier, and we're just going to kind of skip over that for a moment. Happy to answer questions about it later. And the prospective data is of operative and non-operative patients, although I'm going to make some comments on this coming up. So all operative patients, that's fairly easy to define. The non-operative patients, we've basically defined the patients that we used for non-flail without necessarily displacement. So we've decided 3 or more ribs with a chest injury that warrants hospital admission. So if you see the person down in the ED and they're 25 years old and they're non-displaced and they're going to go home, they don't need to be in CIID. If they're admitted for other reasons and they have a first and second rib fracture that's non-displaced, but they got admitted for their TBI, probably not that important either. And then the third criteria is sort of a very important one, which is you're going to have to determine what sorts of resources you have at your site, because it is data intensive. The data is intensive to collect and get in there on a daily basis. I'm going to make some comments about that, but if you're Dr. Parachi and you have an army of people that follow you around and multiple research assistants, you might be a little bit better off than some of the rest of us who are sort of lone wolves trying to gather this data. I'm going to pick on Dr. Parachi here because he's the co-chairman of the database committee, yet I consistently have to make these presentations. Just kidding for that. Okay, so just some really important pieces now about CIID and sort of what to think about as we're moving forward for research, as well as you're thinking about joining. And there's this thing called the GIGO effect, and it stands for garbage in is garbage out. So if you put crappy data into CIID, we're going to have crappy data in CIID, and we're going to do crappy studies out of CIID. I mean, it's pretty simple. And so it's really important that we manage the integrity of this data. And part of the charge of the database committee has been, how are we going to do this? So we are going to automate some of the processes for management of the data integrity. and we're going to spot check with some immediate real-time validity. The other thing is we're trying to work towards a centralized data management coalition that's going to sort of oversee this and maybe even fund a data management individual. So it all starts at your site. It starts that you manage your site, that you get the people you need on at your site. So when you come on board at CIID, there is going to be an administrator assigned to that site. That administrator will be assigned by the database committee and through Sarah Ann. So if you know, I'm just looking here. So Brian Kim is the person at Mayo, and he signed the DUA, and he's going to be the head person. Brian will get an email that welcomes him to CIID. He can then add as many users as he wants at his site, and he can control their access for what they can have. So an administrator can control the account, and a user can control the adding and editing data. So it becomes the role of the administrator at that site to assign people to verify the validity of the data. And here are some of the challenges. You know, there's a lot to this. I'm going to show you some of the pages. It's fairly time intensive. Some of the fields are very easy and quick, and you can very rapidly deploy them. You know, age, date of birth, date of operation, some of that stuff is pretty quick. Some things require some assistance from your registrars, you know, the ISS of the patient, you know, the total hospital length of stay might need to be adjusted. You might need to go in and catch secondary outcomes for readmissions. And some of this becomes reasonably difficult. So we are working on some site-specific solutions. Currently, many of us use Epic. And the company that helped us build the database, which is Firefly, has had some, they've worked with Epic in the past to integrate and automate some of the systems. So we're working on doing that. And I think that that's where the real future is going to be. The future is going to be automating not just the daily field values, but things like the patient survey at 3 months for the quality of life survey, where we can actually push that survey to the patient. They can fill it out on their smartphone and submit it, and it goes right back into the database, as opposed to currently the way I'm doing it in my office. I give them the paper printed out, they fill it out, and then I transpose it back into the system. So you know, we talked about the spot checking, and so some of the things we're going to do to spot check is we're going to pick a couple of fields. And so one of the things that we get when we come on as administrators and as data integrity validation, we look at the BMI of the patients that are put in. So if you see here, this is just an example of some of the sites. I'd like to congratulate University of Cincinnati for having a 60 plus BMI patient that they have in their database. Good job. But you can see here that along these sites, that some sites like University of Alabama does not have BMI input. So that would be a red flag for us to go back and review some of their data and be sure that they're inputting things appropriately. So here are some of the other things that we're looking at for quality metrics, the grid status, and I'll show you what that is in a minute, and the operating room time status for operative patients. And you can see Denver Health has only the operative time entered for about 5 patients. And we know that that's probably unlikely the amount of patients that they have operated on. It's just just a little detail that's missing. So those are sort of the spot checks of data where we can kind of red flag for data completeness. And then the next piece is going to be sort of how are you stacking up compared to the rest of the people in the database. So for right now, we're separating this out. So if you see on the left here for the blunt pulmonary contusion, these were pulled from my login. But if you are Dave Morris at Intermountain, and you want to see how you're stacking up against the rest of the nation, you will get your grid that describes your variables and your patient population. And then you'll get to compare that. Oh, sorry about that. You're going to get to compare that against the rest of the nation. And when I say the nation, I mean those other people that are contributing to the database. So this is one of the big pushes that you can use to sell CIID to your hospital administration, which is, look, we're at the leading edge of doing, pretty much everybody in CWIS fits this characteristic, which is we're at the leading edge of this operation. Even if you are Francis Ali Osman and you do 300 a year, that is still small potatoes compared to the 3,000 that are done across the US. And while you might be able to track your own outcomes, you don't really know how you're doing comparatively to other top performers of this operation. So if we get this right and everybody has good quality data, and you want to know, how many ribs do I fix compared to everybody else, you can go in and pull out the data that says Andy Doben does, on average, he fixes 5 ribs, he uses 6 plates, and it takes him 3 hours and 30 minutes. The rest of the country does 6 ribs, 6 plates, and takes an hour and 20 minutes. I might be a negative outlier, much like you see your quarterly reports for NSQIP or TQIP, if you guys are familiar with that. So that's sort of the long-term goal of where the quality initiative of this will give us a better sense. You'll be able to compare ISS, you'll be able to compare BPC, you'll be able to compare a whole bunch of metrics. So where are we going? And this is the sort of the piece that is so apropos right now to RESIM. And that is, we'd like to use CIID as the baseline for as many research projects as we can. There is a very tight balance between data fatigue and data integrity. What I mean by that is, if Frank Zhao wants to run a study on cryoablation, and he wants us to put in 5 fields that relate to cryoablation, that's going to be very difficult to do for every single person who uses CIID. So instead, what we'd like to do is to build a plugin that when you participate in the study, you check a box that says patient is part of the cryoablation study, and then it will pop open that module that has those specific questions. So that's what we're working on in regards to all research, that the baseline characteristics are calculated within CIID, and then this module, this plugin, can enhance the metrics that you're trying to collect. I briefly touched upon site-specific dashboard with statistics. The other thing is that we're hoping to create 2 export modules. The first one is one that you can export your data from your site if you want to do a single center study. You don't need to apply to CWIS for that data because it's your data. The second one is if you want to do a study that contains the entire data set from all contributors to CIID. And the way that will work is you will perform an export. You'll request from the research committee a proposal to get the full export. And the way that's going to work is you have to contribute to CIID to get the data collection. You will, if for the complete data set, it will be a larger dump, and it takes a little bit of time. So you request it through the research committee. There'll be a form. We're working on that with the research committee a little bit, and you'll have to have a proposal. The other thing is you will have to obtain IRB approval at your specific site for it would be a retrospective de-identified review of prospectively collected data. So it should be a fairly easy IRB to obtain. And then once you have the proposal and it goes to the research committee, if they grant your proposal valid, we will provide you with an export of the data set. And so what can it do for your research? It is going to be very detailed. And this is the piece that I'm going to show you next, which is the fracture location and morphology is completely different than anything that we've seen before. It also mirrors the paper that John Edwards and the CIID community did on the taxonomy. And we've not to date, with the exception of the non-flail study, have had as extensive data on repair, fractures, and equipment as we've had to date. And I'm hoping at the end of this, Dr. Parachi will be able to comment on that, because this is similar to the data set that was used in non-flail. So this is a direct example right out of CIID, for those of you who haven't seen it. And if you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to go onto the website. On the CWI Society/CIID website, there is a test site that is free to use. The username and password is listed there, and you can go in and play with this as much as you want. But you'll see on the left side here in the upper left corner is a grid of exactly what type of fractures there are. With each one, there's a diagram of the example of the type of fracture and where that fracture is located. And you can put in an undisplaced or an offset fracture or displaced fracture on the fifth rib in the posterior lateral location. Additionally, you can calculate other injuries and ISS and BPC. When you actually go in and you click and you do your repair, you can then select the type of plates you use. You can actually click where you have created these repairs, whether or not you used a subcutaneous drain, you did local regional pain control using a liposomal rib block versus cryo. You can determine whether or not you use lung isolation or thoracoscopy, and who the surgeon was. So again, very, very highly detailed information. And this page is actually, for those of you who haven't filled it out, this I actually sit and can do while they're waking the patient up from anesthesia. It really doesn't take that long, and it helps me kind of think through what I'm going to do for my operative report anyway. So here's really the important story, is in 3 months' time, we collected over 300 patients within the database over 7 sites. And as most of you know, one of the largest studies that was ever conducted was a group of CIID people that put together a retrospective database of over 900 patients. And that took over 10 years of data. And within a few months, we've almost reached half of that. And I think that this is really going to be the story that's going to be so important, is if we can get enough people to gather together, we will be able to very, very quickly surpass any of the numbers that we've seen in studies to date. Another couple things, these are some of the futures of estimating survival probability based on our peers, based on what our ISSs are, and what we anticipate our case growth to be. These are all things that our hospital administrators would love to see us be able to produce. And then some issues about some additional futures of heat mapping and mechanisms of injury and any sort of metrics that we want to compose to use to compare ourselves to others. So that's all I had. I'm going to stop the share now. I saw there were a couple of chats, but I couldn't quite see them while we were going. Let's see. So Brian said at the participating sites, who fills out the data fields in CIID? And so Brian, it's very variable. I actually had an APP that was doing a lot of it for me, but with the pandemic and downsizing, she left, and I now have somebody working with me. And then I have my residents actually taking daily notes so that I can do it and making it much quicker and trying to automate it. So it's very variable who's doing it. I know Fred has had Kiara doing some of it. And so it really depends. Chris Janowak is doing the majority of it himself, and he's quite facile with it, but it's a major time commitment to doing this.